I spent 41 years pulling wire through walls so other families could have light in their homes. Funny thing is, it took my own two sons less than a month to leave me sitting in the dark. I didn't see it coming, not really, not until the night I found myself standing in my own garage at 11 o'clock, holding a space heater that didn't work, staring at a door I used to walk through like I owned the place. Because I did own it. I still do. They just don't know what that actually means yet. Welcome to True Elder Tales. If stories about real families, real heartbreak, and real justice mean something to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, tap like, and this time, do me a favor in the comments. Tell me the last home improvement project you ever tackled yourself. I read every single one. Now, let's get into it. My name is George Whitfield. I'm 68 years old and I lived, before all this started, in a 5-bedroom house on Maple Crest Drive in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. I built half of that house with my own hands. Rewired the whole thing twice over the years, added the sunroom myself back in '98, put in the deck where my late wife, Carol, used to sit every morning with her coffee and watch the birds fight over the feeder. Carol passed 6 years ago. Cancer. Fast the way it sometimes is, here one season and gone the next. After that the house got quiet. Too quiet some days. I kept busy. Did small electrical jobs for neighbors even after I retired from the union just to have somewhere to be. And I raised 2 boys in that house, Austin and Chase, 4 years apart, thick as thieves when they were young and about as different as 2 men can be once they grew up. Austin's the older one. 38 now, works in commercial real estate, drives a car that costs more than I made in a year back when I was starting out. Chase is 34, sells insurance, always got some new investment he's excited about, always a little short on cash despite it. Neither one of them called much after their mother died. A birthday here, a Christmas there. I told myself that was just how men their age were. Busy, building their own lives. I didn't blame them for it, not out loud anyway. Then, back in March, Austin called me on a Tuesday evening. I remember because I was watching the news with a plate of leftover meatloaf on my lap. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about something." Turned out his marriage had hit a rough patch, and the way he explained it, staying at the house for just a little while would give him and his wife room to sort things out without the kids underfoot in some cramped apartment. I said sure. Of course I said sure. He's my son. I had 4 empty bedrooms upstairs collecting dust, and it didn't sit right with me to say no to family. 3 weeks later, Chase called. Same story, different details. His landlord was selling the building he rented in. Market was tight. He needed a few months to find something new. Could he and his wife and their 2 kids stay with me too, just temporarily? I said yes to that one too. What kind of father turns his own children away? By the end of April, my house on Maple Crest Drive had 2 grown sons, 2 daughters-in-law, and 3 grandchildren living under my roof. It got loud fast, louder than it had been since the boys were teenagers themselves. I didn't mind the noise, honestly. After years of silence, I found myself almost grateful for it. I told myself this was what family was supposed to look like. I should have paid closer attention to the little things. The first sign was small. Austin's wife, Danielle, mentioned one evening at dinner that the master bedroom, my bedroom, the one Carol and I shared for 30 years, got the best light in the morning, and wouldn't it make more sense for the kids to have it, since they needed the space more than one old man sleeping alone. I laughed it off, told her I liked my room just fine. 2 days later, I came home from the hardware store to find my dresser already moved into what used to be my home office down the hall. Nobody asked me. Somebody just did it. "We figured you wouldn't mind, Dad," Austin said, not even looking up from his phone. "The kids were fighting over who got which room. This just made the most sense." I stood in that hallway for a long moment, looking at my own furniture sitting in a room half its size, and something in my chest went tight and cold. But I didn't argue. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I told myself I was being an old man about it, too set in my ways. That was my first mistake. I've made a few more since. By the middle of May, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. Chase's wife, Priya, had reorganized my kitchen so thoroughly I couldn't find my own coffee mugs without asking. The grandkids were sweet. Don't get me wrong. I loved having them around, but somewhere along the way, I'd gone from being the man of the house to being something more like a guest who happened to still be paying the property taxes. Then came the night in the garage. It was a Thursday, cold for late May, the kind of night where Ohio can't decide if it's still spring or pretending to be winter. I'd gone to bed early, tired from a long day helping a neighbor rewire her porch light. Around 10, I heard raised voices downstairs, some argument between the boys and their wives about whose turn it was to handle the grocery bill that month. I came down to see if everything was all right. Austin met me at the bottom of the stairs before I even got there. "Dad, hey, actually, can we talk for a second?" The way he said it, careful, rehearsed almost, told me something was coming that I wasn't going to like. "Chase and I were talking," he said. "With everybody in the house now, 7 of us plus you, it's just gotten really tight. And Priya's back is bad, she really shouldn't be on the pull-out couch anymore, and we thought maybe, just until things settled down, you could take the garage. We already put a cot out there for you. It's not permanent, Dad, just temporary." I stood there in my own front hallway, in the house I built with my own 2 hands, and listened to my 38-year-old son explain to me, calm as anything, that there wasn't room for me in it anymore. "The garage," I repeated. "It's got the heater," Chase chimed in from the kitchen doorway like that settled it. "We'll get you a space heater. It's not a big deal, Dad." I want you to understand something about me. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. 41 years running electrical crews taught me that the men who lose their temper are usually the ones who lose the room. So I just nodded, went and got my robe and a pillow, and walked out to the garage myself before either one of them could say another word. The space heater they'd left out there didn't work. I found that out around 11 o'clock, sitting on a cot between my old tool chest and Carol's garden supplies, watching my breath fog up in the cold Ohio air, looking at the door that led back into the house I owned outright, free and clear, every single brick and beam of it. And that's when I remembered something neither one of my sons had ever bothered to ask me about. Something I'd set up quietly with my attorney almost 8 years ago, right after Carol got her diagnosis, back when she and I sat at that kitchen table and made some decisions about what would happen to everything we'd built once we were both gone. They didn't know about the trust. They didn't know what was actually in it, or what it said about who got to decide where this house went, and under what conditions. They'd been so busy rearranging my furniture and moving me into a garage that neither one of them had ever once asked me the one question that actually mattered. Whose name was really on this house? I sat there in the cold, and for the first time since Carol passed, I felt something other than grief. I felt clarity, because come morning I was going to make a phone call, not to my sons, to a man named Walter Briggs who'd been drawing up my legal paperwork for 30 years and who was about to remind 2 grown men that a house isn't just walls and a roof. It's whoever's name is actually on the deed. Morning came in gray and cold, the kind of light that makes a garage feel even smaller than it is. I hadn't slept much, if I'm honest. Somewhere around 4, I gave up trying and just lay there on that cot listening to the house wake up above me, footsteps on the kitchen floor, the coffee maker gurgling through the wall, my grandkids' voices rising and falling as they got ready for school. All of it happening without me. All of it happening in my own house. I waited until I heard Austin's car pull out of the driveway around 8, then Chase's 20 minutes after that, both of them off to their jobs like nothing unusual had happened the night before. Like moving their father into an unheated garage was just another Thursday. Then I went inside, made myself a pot of coffee in my own kitchen, sat down at the table Carol and I bought back in 1994 and called Walter Briggs. Walter's office was in a small brick building downtown, the kind of place that hadn't changed its carpet since the Clinton administration. He'd handled my affairs since before Carol got sick, and he picked up on the second ring, the way he always did. "George," he said, "it's been a while, everything all right?" "Not exactly," I said. "You got a few minutes this morning? I need to go over the trust again, the one Carol and I set up." There was a pause on the line, the kind where I could hear him sitting up a little straighter in his chair. "Of course," he said. "Come by around 10, I'll pull the file." I showered, put on a clean shirt, and drove myself downtown in the truck I'd owned since before either of my sons could walk. Walter's office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, same as it always had. He met me at the door himself, shook my hand, and led me back to his desk, where a manila folder already sat waiting, my name typed across the tab. "So," he said, settling into his chair, reading glasses sliding down his nose, "tell me what's going on." I told him all of it. Austin moving in with his family in March, Chase following a few weeks later, the bedroom, the kitchen, the way my own house had slowly stopped feeling like mine, one small decision at a time, and then the garage. I watched Walter's face as I described the cot, the broken space heater, the cold coming up through the concrete floor most of the night. He didn't say much while I talked, just listened, the way good lawyers do, taking the occasional note on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose for a moment before he spoke. "George, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do your sons know what's actually in this trust?" "No," I said. "They know Carol and I set something up. They don't know the specifics, never asked." Walter nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then let me refresh your memory on what you're actually holding here, because I don't think even you remember all of it." He opened the folder and turned it around so I could see the paperwork Carol and I had signed 8 years earlier. The house on Maple Crest Drive wasn't in my name anymore, not directly. It belonged to the Whitfield Family Trust, an irrevocable trust that Carol and I had set up together, back when we were thinking clearly about what would happen to everything we'd built once one of us was gone. I was the sole trustee. I had complete control over the property, who lived there, and what happened to it, for the rest of my life. But here was the part I'd genuinely forgotten, the part that hit me square in the chest sitting in that office. The original beneficiary designation, the people who'd inherit the trust's assets after I passed, wasn't fixed. Carol and I had built in a provision that let the surviving trustee, meaning me, amend the beneficiary at any point, for any reason, without needing anyone's permission or signature. "You can change who inherits this house today if you wanted to," Walter said. "This afternoon if you wanted to. It's entirely your call, George. It always has been." I sat there for a long moment, staring at Carol's signature next to mine on that 8-year-old document, feeling something shift in my chest that I hadn't expected. Not anger exactly, something colder and steadier than that. "Why would you ask if they know the specifics?" I said. "What made you think they didn't?" Walter leaned back in his chair, and for the first time that morning he looked genuinely troubled. "Because 2 weeks ago, I got a call from a title company, someone requesting a preliminary property valuation on your house, George, on behalf of a client preparing for what they called an anticipated ownership transition." The room went quiet enough that I could hear the old clock ticking on his wall. "Who requested it?" I said. It wasn't really a question. The paperwork listed Austin Whitfield as the contact. I didn't say anything for a while. I just sat there, letting that settle into place next to everything else. My son, who told me in March that he needed a temporary place to stay while he sorted out his marriage, had apparently been sorting out something else entirely. Getting my house appraised, getting it ready to sell or borrow against, or whatever it was he had planned months before he ever asked to move in. "There's more," Walter said quietly. "I made a call myself yesterday, after you scheduled this appointment, just to see if there was anything on record. Turns out Austin's real estate firm has him listed on two separate loan applications this year, both of them citing expected inheritance from primary residence as collateral support. Both applications are still pending. He's borrowing against a house that isn't his, I said. He's borrowing against a house he assumes will be his, Walter corrected gently. Those aren't the same thing, and I don't think he understands that yet. I thought about Austin standing in my hallway 2 nights ago, telling me so calmly that there wasn't room for me anymore, that the garage would only be temporary. I thought about Danielle mentioning, almost in passing, how much better light the master bedroom got in the morning. I thought about every small, patient shove that had pushed me further and further toward the edges of my own life, one reasonable-sounding request at a time. They hadn't been making room for their families. They'd been making room for themselves. In a house they'd already started spending in their heads. "What about Chase?" I asked. "Anything on him?" Walter shook his head. "Nothing that's crossed my desk. Doesn't mean there's nothing there. Just means I haven't found it yet." I sat back in that worn leather chair and looked at the folder on Walter's desk, at Carol's signature, at the quiet, patient power that document had been sitting on for 8 years without either of my sons ever once asking what it actually said. "I want to change the beneficiary," I said. Walter picked his pen back up. "To who?" And that's when I told him about the letter I'd read 3 weeks earlier, tucked into a stack of mail I almost threw away without opening. A letter from an organization called Buckeye Veterans Outreach, a small nonprofit 2 counties over that ran a transitional shelter for veterans coming out of homelessness, men who'd served their country and came home to nothing waiting for them. I donated to them for years, small amounts, nothing anyone would notice. But that letter had mentioned they were looking for a permanent facility, something bigger than the rented space they were currently squeezed into. I hadn't thought much about it at the time, just filed it away in the back of my mind the way you do with things that touch you but don't demand an answer yet. Sitting in Walter's office now, though, it didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It felt like the answer had been sitting on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks, waiting for me to be ready to see it. "I want to look into something before we finalize anything," I told Walter. "But I think I know exactly where this house is going to end up, and it isn't with either one of my sons." Walter almost smiled. "You want my honest opinion, George?" "Always have. I think Carol would have liked that a great deal more than you think." I drove home that afternoon with the folder sitting on the passenger seat beside me, and for the first time since the boys had moved in, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life anymore. I pulled into my driveway, sat there for a moment looking up at the house I'd built with my own hands, every wire, every wall, every inch of it mine. I still hadn't decided everything. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain as I climbed out of that truck and walked toward my own front door. Whatever Austin thought he already owned, he was about to find out exactly how wrong he was. The Buckeye Veterans Outreach building sat off a 2-lane road about 40 minutes east of Columbus, tucked between a feed store and an old grain elevator that hadn't been used in years. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. A converted warehouse with a hand-painted sign and a gravel lot. But the moment I stepped through the front door, I understood why that letter had stuck with me for 3 weeks. A woman named Deb Ferris ran the place, a stocky, no-nonsense type in her 50s who'd apparently been doing this work since her own husband came home from Desert Storm with more scars than anyone could see. She walked me through the building herself, past a cramped common room where 6 or 7 men sat playing cards, past a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at once, past sleeping quarters that were really just a converted storage area with cots lined up too close together. "We're at double capacity right now," Deb told me, not complaining, just stating a fact. "Turn away 2, 3 men a month because we don't have the beds. Most of them end up back on the street or in a shelter that isn't built for what they've actually been through." I thought about my own garage, the cot, the broken space heater, one cold night that had felt unbearable to me. Then I thought about men who'd spent months, years sometimes, with nowhere steady to land at all. What would it take, I asked her, to actually fix this? Not patch it, fix it. Deb looked at me for a long moment, like she wasn't quite sure why an old stranger in a canvas jacket was asking her that question so seriously. A real building, she said finally. Enough bedrooms that a man gets his own space instead of sleeping 12 feet from a stranger. A kitchen that actually works. Maybe some land out back where the guys could grow something, work with their hands again. That's not a want list, that's just what dignity looks like. But something like that costs more than we'll ever raise in donations and bake sales. I didn't tell her anything that day. Just thanked her for the tour, wrote a check bigger than any I'd written before, and told her I'd be in touch. I drove home with the radio off, turning something over in my mind the whole way, and by the time I pulled back into my driveway on Maple Crest, I'd made my decision. Not the emotional kind, not the kind born out of anger sitting in a cold garage at midnight. The kind that comes after you've slept on something, checked it twice, and found it still holds up in daylight. The house went to Buckeye Veterans Outreach. All of it. The land, the structure, everything Carol and I had built over 34 years of marriage would become a real home for men who'd given up years of their own lives and gotten precious little thanks for it since. I called Walter the next morning and told him to draw up the paperwork. "You're certain," he said. It wasn't really a question either, more like he wanted to hear me say it out loud one more time before he put it into something legal and permanent. "I've never been more certain of anything," I told him. It took Walter the better part of a week to get everything drafted properly, the beneficiary amendment, the transfer conditions, the timeline for when the trust would formally take effect. He built in one provision at my specific request, something he called a life estate clause, which meant I'd retain the right to live in the house for as long as I wanted, or until I decided otherwise. The transfer to Buckeye Veterans Outreach wouldn't fully complete until I either passed away or chose to relocate myself. Nothing would change overnight. Nobody would show up with a moving truck. But the ownership, the true legal ownership, the thing Austin had apparently already been borrowing against in his head, would belong to men who actually knew what it meant to lose everything and rebuild from nothing. I signed the paperwork on a Thursday afternoon in Walter's office, same worn leather chair, same ticking clock on the wall. When I set the pen down, Walter looked at me over his glasses with something that might have been pride. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think this is exactly the kind of thing Carol would have wanted her name attached to." I thought so too. But signing that paperwork was only half the job. I still had to figure out how, and when, to tell my sons what I'd done. I turned that question over for a few days, watching Austin and Chase move through my house like it already belonged to them, watching their wives redecorate rooms Carol and I had built with our own hands, listening to my grandchildren's laughter drift up through the floorboards of a garage I still hadn't been invited back out of. Then, on a Sunday evening, Priya announced over dinner that she and Chase had been talking, and they thought it made sense to schedule a family meeting that coming Friday. "Nothing serious," she said, "just some practical conversation about long-term living arrangements now that everyone was settled in so nicely." I almost laughed out loud at the table. Settled in so nicely, like they'd been waiting patiently for permission that had never actually been given. "Friday works fine for me," I said instead, keeping my voice as calm and pleasant as I could manage. "I think that's a good idea, long overdue actually." Austin looked up from his plate, something flickering behind his eyes, like he hadn't expected me to agree so easily. "Great," he said slowly. "Yeah, Friday then." I spent the next few days quietly preparing. I called Walter and asked him to be present at the meeting, not as a lawyer looming over the table, just as a family friend stopping by, the way he'd done at holidays for years before Carol passed. I called Deb Ferris and let her know that everything was moving forward on my end, that there would be an announcement coming soon that might interest her organization a great deal. And I spent one quiet evening alone in the garage, sitting on that cot one more time, not out of punishment this time, but because I wanted to remember exactly how it had felt. Cold concrete under my feet, my own breath fogging in front of me, the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being unwanted in a place you built with your own two hands. I wanted to remember it clearly because come Friday, I intended for it to be the last night either of my sons ever assumed they knew what this house, or what I, actually belonged to. Friday arrived cool and clear, one of those late spring evenings in Ohio where the light stretches out long and gold before it finally gives up and goes dark. Everyone gathered around the dining room table at 7, Austin and Danielle on one side, Chase and Priya on the other, the grandkids sent off to the den with a movie so the grown-ups could talk. Walter arrived a few minutes later, letting himself in the front door the way he always had, greeting everyone warmly, settling into the empty chair beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world. I saw Austin's eyes narrow slightly when Walter sat down, just slightly, like some small, quiet alarm had gone off somewhere in the back of his mind, one he couldn't quite name yet. "So," Chase said, folding his hands on the table, doing his best impression of a man in control of the room. "Dad, we wanted to talk about how things are going. Long term, I mean, with the living situation." I looked around that table at my sons, at the wives who'd rearranged my kitchen and claimed my bedroom without ever once asking, at the empty chair at the head of the table where Carol used to sit, and I felt something settle deep and steady in my chest. "Funny you should bring that up," I said, "because I've actually been thinking about the exact same thing." The table went quiet for a second. Chase blinked, like he hadn't expected me to agree with him so fast, and Austin's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean the same thing?" Chase asked. "I mean I've had some time to think about this house," I said, "about who's living in it, what everyone needs, and what makes the most sense going forward. Seems like you two had the same idea." Danielle smiled, relaxing back into her chair. "That's great, George. We were thinking, honestly, long-term, it might make sense to look at some kind of formal arrangement. Maybe update the deed, get everyone's names on it properly so there's no confusion down the road, for estate purposes." There it was, laid out plain and polite across my own dinner table, dressed up in language soft enough that nobody had to say the real words out loud. They wanted the house, not eventually. Now, or as close to now as they could manage without sounding greedy about it. "Estate purposes," I repeated, keeping my voice even. "That's interesting you'd bring that up, Danielle, because I actually did some work on the estate recently myself." Austin set his fork down completely now, watching me with the kind of careful attention I hadn't seen from him since he was a teenager caught sneaking back in past curfew. "What kind of work?" he asked. I looked over at Walter, who gave me a small nod, and I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded copy of the paperwork I'd signed in his office 3 days earlier. "This house was never technically in my name," I said. "Not since 2016. Your mother and I put it into a family trust after her diagnosis, back when we were thinking clearly about what would happen to everything once one of us was gone. I've been the sole trustee this whole time, full control over the property for as long as I'm alive." I watched that information land differently on each of their faces. Chase looked confused, like he was still catching up. Priya's expression didn't change much at all. But Austin went very still, the particular stillness of a man doing fast math in his head and not liking the answer he was arriving at. "Okay," Austin said slowly. "So it's in a trust. That's fine, that doesn't really change anything, does it? I mean, eventually it still comes to us." "That's the part I wanted to talk to you both about tonight," I said. "See, the trust had a provision built into it from the start. As trustee, I've always had the right to amend who inherits the property, any time for any reason without needing anyone's approval. The room had gone very quiet. Even the sound of the kids' movie down the hall seemed to fade into the background. Amend it to who? Chase asked, though something in his voice told me he already suspected the answer wasn't going to be him. About 3 weeks ago, I said, I got a letter in the mail from a veterans outreach organization about an hour east of here. They run a shelter for men coming out of homelessness after military service. Overcrowded, underfunded, turning away people who genuinely have nowhere else to go. I paused, looking around the table at my sons, at the daughters-in-law who'd rearranged my kitchen without asking, at the empty chair where Carol used to sit every Sunday dinner for 34 years. Last Thursday, I signed the paperwork transferring this house, the entire trust, to that organization, effective upon my death or whenever I choose to relocate myself, whichever comes first. Dinpal's mouth actually fell open. Priya set her wine glass down harder than she probably meant to. You did what? Austin's voice cracked slightly on the last word, the careful, composed, real estate professional cracking right along with it. Dad, you can't just, that's insane, that's our inheritance. You can't just give the house away to strangers. They're not strangers, I said, and for the first time all evening, I let a little heat into my voice. They're men who served this country and came home to nothing. And as for it being your inheritance, Austin, I'd love to know when exactly you and I discussed that. Because near as I can tell, the only conversation about this house's future happened between you and a title company 2 months ago, when you had it appraised without ever mentioning a word of it to me. The color drained out of Austin's face so fast I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. How did you? He started, then stopped himself. Walter mentioned it, I said, nodding toward my old friend who sat quietly beside me, letting the moment breathe. Along with the 2 loan applications you've got pending right now, both of them listing this house as expected collateral. You've been borrowing against a home you don't own, son, based on money that was never promised to you in the first place. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Chase looked over at his brother like he was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. You did that, Chase said quietly. You had the house appraised and you didn't tell either one of us. It doesn't matter now, Austin snapped, though his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. None of this matters if Dad just gave the whole thing away to a bunch of. Careful, I said, my voice quiet but hard enough that he stopped mid-sentence. Finish that thought carefully, Austin, because the next words out of your mouth are going to tell me a lot about the kind of man you turned into while I wasn't paying close enough attention. He didn't finish the sentence. He just sat there, jaw working, staring down at the table like it might offer him a way out of the corner he'd talked himself into. I want to be very clear about something, I said, looking around the table at all of them now. I didn't do this out of spite. I didn't do it because I'm angry about the garage, though I won't pretend that didn't sting. I did it because somewhere over the last 2 months, I stopped being your father in this house and started being an inconvenience you were managing. You moved my furniture without asking. You put me out in the cold without a second thought. And the entire time, at least one of you was already spending money you assumed would eventually be yours, based on a house you never once asked me a single real question about. Dinpal was crying quietly now, though I couldn't tell if it was from guilt or simply from watching a large sum of money disappear in real time. Priya reached over and took Chase's hand under the table. What happens now? Chase asked finally. His voice had lost all of its earlier rehearsed calm. He just sounded tired and maybe a little bit ashamed. Now, I said, I'd like my bedroom back, and I think it's probably time everyone started making other living arrangements. Not tonight, not tomorrow, I'm not going to put grandchildren out on the street, but soon. This is still my house, Juntman, for as long as I'm alive to live in it, and I intend to. Austin stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over behind him. This is unbelievable. You're seriously doing this. over a few weeks of adjustment. "I'm doing this," I said calmly, "because I spent 41 years building things with my own two hands, and somewhere along the way, both of you got the idea that everything I built existed for you to take, rather than something I chose to share. There's a difference, Austin. I don't think either one of you understood that until tonight." He left the table without another word, footsteps heavy on the stairs, a bedroom door slamming somewhere above us a moment later. Chase sat there a while longer, staring at his hands, before he finally looked up at me. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I didn't know about the appraisal or the loans. I want you to know that." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Austin moved his family out within 10 days, tight-lipped and furious the whole time, barely speaking to me beyond what was strictly necessary. He still hasn't called much since. Some wounds, I've learned, take longer to close than others, especially the ones a man opens in his own pride. Chase was different. He and Priya found a small rental about 15 minutes away, and he came by more than I expected him to, sometimes just to help me fix something around the house, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk. A few weeks ago, he asked if he could bring the kids by on Saturdays, the way they used to before all of this started. I told him the door was always open, same as it had always been. I finished moving my things back into the master bedroom on a warm evening in June, setting Carol's photograph back on the nightstand where it belonged, right beside the window that catches the morning light. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long while afterward, looking around at a room that finally felt like mine again. Deb Furras called me last week with an update. Ground broke on the new facility a few days ago, funded in part by proceeds she'd already started raising against the trust's eventual value. 22 private rooms, a real kitchen, a garden out back, the same kind of thing she described to me that first afternoon I walked through her door. She asked if I'd like to come see it when it's finished. I told her I wouldn't miss it for the world. I think about Carol a lot these days, more than I have in years, honestly. I think she'd have understood exactly why I did what I did. Not out of anger, out of the simple, plain belief that everything we built together deserves to go somewhere it's actually appreciated, rather than somewhere it's simply assumed. 41 years, I spent pulling wire through other people's walls so their families could have a little light. Funny thing, in the end, is that it took losing my own bedroom for a few cold weeks to remind me exactly what that light was worth, and exactly who deserved to stand in it. If you made it this far, thank you for spending this time with me and with George's story. If it moved you even a little, I'd ask you to hit that subscribe button before you go, so you don't miss the next one. And I'll leave you with the same question I've been asking myself ever since that night in the garage. If it were your name on the deed, and your own children treating your home like it already belonged to them, what would you have done differently? I'll see you in the next story.